All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to what is coming to the end of week 2 of our coronavirus pandemic isolation and social distancing. Again, we're trying to stream both on Facebook here and then on YouTube. So if you can't access Facebook, then please access YouTube or make your choice which one you want. But we are going to broadcast both of or broadcast our time here together both on Facebook and on YouTube. As we go along, if you have any questions that you want to post, go ahead and post those on online here, either through the Facebook or YouTube stream, and I'll try and answer those. I don't know that I'll be answering them live in person, but maybe the next time we stream, if there's questions that arise from the teaching this morning, then I can hit those next week sometime. Well, so the topic of today's teaching is really going to be centered and revolved around the question that came up during our question and answer time with our panel yesterday, and it really revolves around the idea of what does this current crisis with COVID-19, what does it mean as far as biblical prophecy is concerned? Does the Bible talk about this or things like this? Is this an indication or a sign of something to come with regards to biblical prophecy or the end of the world? It's really amazing that when situations in history like this come, it always spurs an interest in prophecy. And we can go for months or years, not really even think about prophecy or the end of the world. I know some people are more into studying it, but what I found, just the average person in the church doesn't think a lot about it. In fact, the reason is because I think biblical prophecy seems to be confusing in the scriptures, and it can be. It can be a difficult topic to unravel and kind of work through, but I think it's important that we take time to work through it and to wrestle with it. There's a lot of different views with regards to the interpretation of some of the prophecies that Jesus made in the Bible concerning his second coming and the end of the age. And so what I thought I would do today is go to really the main portion of Jesus' teaching during his earthly ministry, where he talks about specifically questions related to events with regards to the future. And they were questions his disciples asked him. And so if you're following along today, please grab a Bible or look one up on your app on your phone, because you're going to want to follow the text, okay? And we're going to be working primarily out of Matthew chapter 24 today. And it's going to be important for you to really kind of follow along with the verses that I'm going to be reading and talking through. I'll tell you on the outset that Matthew 24 is not the easiest passage of Scripture. It's not Jesus' easiest teaching to interpret. Scholars that work through this text have some struggles, and we're going to identify why it's difficult to interpret and why so many kind of different perspectives or interpretations have come out of Matthew 24. But we're going to do our best today to really kind of answer the primary question for you. We won't answer all of the questions from Matthew chapter 24, not today anyway. It'll probably pose more questions as far as interpretation than it answers. However, I think we can answer the main question that people are kind of asking. Boy, we look at the world around us, right? And within a matter of days, our world really changed, right? And whether it will ever go back to the way it was, or whether we have a fundamental kind of shift or change moving forward where there will be a new normal, nobody knows the answer to that. We're promised, by politicians and those in Washington, it'll be back to normal and it'll be better than ever. Yeah, maybe. I hope, but maybe not. We're really not sure. And so this situation has not only rocked our lives here, but it's rocked the lives of millions of people around the world. And so when you see an event of global proportions like this, it really causes you to sit back and say, wow, does the Bible say anything about this? Is this a sign of something? And so we're going to work through pretty much Jesus' teaching today in Matthew chapter 24, and I think get some answers to that question. What does this event have to do with what Jesus said would happen with regards to the future? And so if you have a Bible, go to Matthew chapter 24. We're going to work through it. There's really two primary perspectives with regards to this text that we're going to go over today, and give you kind of both views and let you wrestle with both of those. But the context of Matthew chapter 24 is massively important for understanding why Matthew 24 is even in the Bible and why Jesus went through this teaching. This is called the Olivet Discourse. And in case you were wondering, if you ever hear that term, they're speaking of the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 24, speaking to his disciples, teaching them on the Mount of Olives, and giving them an answer to questions they had specifically asked him. If you look in chapter 23, Jesus says this. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And so chapter 23, just within the context of 24, is Jesus really declaring these woes against Israel. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. Woe unto you, blind guides. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. He says over and over. So he declares these judgments or these woes against Israel. And the point of that is Israel had completely rejected Jesus as Messiah. All of those Old Testament prophecies that talk about the coming king and the coming Messiah who would be a deliverer and a king and bring in a kingdom. Jesus was that, right? He was the fulfillment of all of those Old Testament promises and types and shadows pointing to a deliverer, pointing to a king, pointing to a kingdom. And they rejected him. So Jesus really declared these kind of Old Testament prophetic woes against Jerusalem and against Israel. He makes some pretty staggering statements. He says, "I would have gathered you as a hen gathers her brood under her wings." He says, "You were not willing." And then he makes this statement in verse 38 of 23, "See, your house is left to you desolate." And he's referring to the temple there. So sitting on the Mount of Olives, he would have been able to see the temple in all of its glory and all of its splendor. I mean, the first century temple, Herod's temple that he had built in Jerusalem, was magnificent, and people came from all over to see its glory and all of its beauty. And so seeing that scene there on the Mount of Olives, he says, "Your house, your temple will be desolate." And in chapter 24, Jesus left the temple, now going up to the Mount of Olives. So he'd been in the temple area, now he's going up to the Mount of Olives. Went away with his disciples and came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. He answered them, kind of pointing to the temple in the background. "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So Jesus is prophesying an utter and complete destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which for a first century Israelite would have just been a massively incredible thing that wouldn't have even been fathomable. I mean, their temple was the center of worship. Their temple was where they knew and experienced the presence of God, and the temple was everything to those who were Jews at the time. And Jesus says it'll be destroyed. Not one stone will be left upon another. So verse 3, he sat on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age." So the disciples come to him after Jesus makes these kind of radical statements, and they're shaken, they're stirred by his comments. And they're immediately thinking what we all tend to think. Wow, when something of that magnitude happens, certainly it's the end of the age, right? Certainly it's the coming of the end, right? And the disciples here in this text were no different than us. We look at events like coronavirus and we say, is this a sign of the end of the age? Is this a sign of Jesus coming? Is this a sign of God's judgment and ultimately, him coming in and coming back again? And so the disciples, upon hearing, wow, what could be worse than the temple being destroyed? In our setting, what could be worse than, an international pandemic that kills potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of people and bankrupts businesses and puts people out of work and cripples, economies? What could be worse than that? I mean, Hollywood's made movies about scenarios just like that, right? And usually they all end in zombies attacking, but you can see the devastation of something. We kind of in our culture have a fascination with apocalyptic events and apocalyptic storytelling, right? How many of our movies and stories are all about this post-apocalyptic world, that we envision? And so as a culture, we're wrapped up in end of the world type of thinking. And so when we see situations like what we're experiencing today, our minds automatically go and say, is this the start of the end? Is this the start of something big that'll change our world completely or hearken the end of the age? Well, the disciples really did the same thing. So they automatically thought if the temple's destroyed, that's got to be the end of the world, right? They were thinking, man, the temple being destroyed, the coming of the end, and then they said, your coming and the end of the age. So immediately the disciples started thinking, destruction of this temple, the decimation of Jerusalem must be the coming of the end of the age and the coming of the Son of Man. And so Jesus answers that question. It's really two questions that they kind of combined into one event. The destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, but also, what does it say in verse 3? Your coming and the end of the age. So it really became two questions that they were kind of squeezing into one event. The disciples thought that the destruction of the temple and his coming and the end of the age would be one event. They just assumed that. And so they were asking Jesus, okay, well, what are the signs of this? And so Jesus doesn't necessarily accept their premise that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the coming of the end of the age and his second coming were both the same event. He doesn't necessarily just accept that that's true, but rather what he does is he goes into a discourse, the Olivet Discourse, of him teaching really both. So you have to understand that what Jesus is talking about in this text, he's talking about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but also he'll talk about his second coming. And so he says in verse 4, see that no one lead you astray. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Now notice this. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. And so Jesus actually calms them and says, listen, in the coming days, you're going to see, many false Christs, many false messiahs. You're going to hear of wars, rumors of wars. And we know that history tells us within the first century, at the time of the disciples, after Christ had died and raised from the dead and ascended to heaven, that it was a breeding ground for false teaching and a breeding ground for false messiahs. And there were wars and rumors of wars all over the world at that time. And Jesus says, but don't let that alarm you. Okay, those are just things that will take place over the course of this time period. And so don't let that alarm you. He says, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And then he says this, verse 7, this is where it gets very concerning because we're like, oh, is this happening now? For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. And so Jesus begins to say, yes, this stuff is coming, but this is just stuff that will happen over the course of this time period, over the course of this age. And so he almost says these are not the signs in and of themselves of the immediacy of either the return of Christ or the destruction of their temple. Remember, those are the two issues that Jesus is tackling, the destruction of the temple, but also his return. And so he's answering that question about those two events. And so he starts out, first of all, by saying, don't be shaken or alarmed when you hear of wars, rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, earthquakes, pestilence, famines, right? We've seen all of those. Over the course of this age, I mean, we've seen famines, we've seen earthquakes, we're seeing coronavirus, but we've seen plagues ravage people, for the past, centuries, right? Jesus is saying, those are signs that just mark this age. In other words, don't let those signs alarm you. They are and of course he's talking to the beginning of birth pains. So anytime a woman is in labor, she begins to feel birth pains, and it gets intense, and then it subsides. It gets intense, and then it subsides. It gets intense, and then it subsides. Eventually, she gives birth. This is the imagery that Jesus is giving. He says in verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout all the world as a testimony to all nations. Then the end will come. Okay, so if we're talking about the question, is this virus, is this economic collapse or whatever that we are experiencing and will experience in the coming days, is this a sign of the coming of the end? Well, according to Jesus' teaching, I think he would say not necessarily. Okay? Not necessarily. And I think we need to be careful not to read too much into crisis events that happen in the world. 2,000 years ago, Jesus said these things will happen. They will happen. And so, what we have to do with this text is we have to identify the two primary ways that this text is really interpreted. One of the primary ways is that Jesus is teaching of events that are all completely pressed into the future. Specifically, beginning with verse 15. Notice what he says. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is in the housetop go down to take what is in the house, and let the one who is in the field turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Now notice this, verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Okay, so that sounds ominous, doesn't it? Like that sounds like, okay, this is end of the world type stuff. And so one of the primary views is that Jesus is teaching primarily about events that will not happen during this age, but events that are all completely future, even future for Jesus and also future for us. The reason being is he talks about a time of great tribulation, right? Such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now and never will be. And so this time, the reasoning primarily behind this being interpreted as completely future is because of those statements. Great tribulation that the world has never experienced nor never will. So many believe and teach that this is teaching about a separate time in the future where Israel will be in the land, her temple will be rebuilt. Why do we know that? Because of this phrase, the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Basically, that term references a prophecy by Daniel wherein an event would take place that would be such an abomination that it would cause the temple to be desolate. And so the future interpretation says this is a time that Daniel prophesied where there is Israel in her land with a rebuilt temple, and something happens in that temple that makes it desolate, and when that happens, people are to flee because it is going to get really dark and really difficult, and great tribulation, such as the world has never seen, will fall upon the people. And so this is what they call a dispensational interpretation, wherein it's all future. The word dispensational really is a way of interpreting the Bible, wherein you see the Bible divided up into different time periods, wherein God, based on the amount of revelation that He had given people, kind of operates in relationship to people. So the dispensational viewpoint basically says that there is a future dispensation, a time period yet to come, prophesied in Daniel 9 called the Great Tribulation period. And just to give you an idea, for those of you that aren't super familiar with biblical prophecy, the dispensational viewpoint basically has a timeline that it's important to understand. The timeline for a dispensational, pre-tribulational timeline, and by pre-tribulational, we mean before tribulation, and the reference to tribulation would be the reference here, great tribulation in Matthew chapter 24, verse 21. So that tribulation, well, what's the pre? What is it talking about? Well, for pre-tribulational theology, that views that a rapture will happen pre or before this time that Jesus is talking about. The 70th week of Daniel, as prophesied in Daniel 9. I'm not going to get into the Daniel 9 prophecy, don't have time for that today, but you can research that and look that up. And so the pre-tribulational, dispensational viewpoint basically says that Jesus is talking about the events that will happen after the rapture of the church. The rapture of the church is Jesus coming in the clouds and raising the dead in Christ, and then those who are alive will be raised and taken off into heaven to celebrate the marriage supper of the Lamb, upon which what will happen on earth would be a 7-year time. Halfway through that 7-year tribulation period, the Antichrist will betray his commitment to Israel and will do something that will be such an abomination that will make the temple desolate. And those who have been saved, and those who have not taken the mark of the beast at that time, according to dispensational theology, will then be instructed to flee, because it's going to get very dark and very difficult. So, if you take a pre-tribulational or a dispensational perspective on this teaching, it's all future. And for those of us who are alive and in Christ, we will not actually be around to experience this. We will be in heaven celebrating the marriage supper of the Lamb during the events described here in Matthew chapter 24. And so the futurist perspective goes on to say, well, let me keep reading. There's time of great tribulation, verse 23, verse 21, verse 22. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. For the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. I mean, it sounds incredibly dark and incredibly difficult, right? Then if anyone says to you, look, there he is, there is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And then, verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So, if you take a dispensational perspective on this text, then what Jesus is teaching is something purely future. It's after the rapture of the church, 7 years of great tribulation on the earth with the Antichrist ruling, and really the latter 3.5 years of that is really the content of what we just read. But we know that at the end of this, and the strength of the dispensational argument really is the flow of thought from verse 28 to 29, immediately after the tribulation, what will happen? Well, then will appear in heaven, verse 30, the Son of Man. And he will, coming in the clouds with power and great glory, and he'll send his angels with a trumpet, right? To trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds of heaven, from one end to the earth to the other. And so the theological process says there, or timeline rather, says that there is a rapture, 7 years of tribulation, wherein people will be saved because of the witness of the 144,000 as seen in the book of Revelation. We don't have time to go there. That people will be saved. There are elect that are on the earth during this time. We see that. And so what you need to understand, just for clarity, is according to a pre-tribulational timeline, there is a difference between the rapture and the second coming. Those are two different events. So the reason the dispensational perspective has to push this into the future is that these verses seem to be clearly talking about what? Not the rapture, but the second coming. Why? Because it comes at the end, or verse 29, after the tribulation. So if the second coming, right, there's the rapture where Jesus kind of comes in the clouds and takes the Christians up, 7 years of tribulation, then what happens is second coming. Therefore, if you take a dispensational pre-tribulational perspective on this text, the coronavirus actually has nothing to do with what Jesus is talking about here, but rather something that's pushed into the future. So is the coronavirus a sign of Jesus' second coming? No, Jesus is talking about the signs of his second coming during the Great Tribulation period, Daniel's 70th week. And so to look at coronavirus and all of these things that are happening from a dispensational perspective is, it's hard to read that into this text here. So what is this? Well, we can get to that. I want to keep working through the text a little bit because Jesus says, okay, follow the thinking. Okay, I want you to follow with me. Rapture, and then tribulation period, which is what this text, according to a dispensational approach, this text is Jesus is teaching about that, which would mean for the disciples, for you and I, we are not around during this. We're just not. So if the dispensational perspective is right, then this is talking about events that will happen after we've been raptured. And the sign of the second coming, so you have the rapture, the 7-year tribulation. What happens at the second coming? Well, the second coming is when Jesus actually comes to earth, right? And then sets up his earthly kingdom. And that's premillennialism. So you have pre-tribulationalism, the rapture happens before the tribulation, and then you have premillennialism, where Jesus' second coming happens right before he sets up an earthly kingdom for 1,000 years. So that's kind of the teaching there of a dispensational approach. And then it goes on to say, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. So if you're a dispensationalist, Jesus is speaking of events during the tribulation period that you're not a part of, we won't be a part of. So when he says, learn the lesson from the fig tree, and look for these signs, summer is near, know that he is near at the very gates. So just as a way of review, verses really 4 through 13 just describe the events of the age. But then verse 15 begins to talk about specific signs, right? The abomination that makes the temple desolate, and this great time of tribulation, right? So learn the lesson. When those things happen, know that he is near at the very gates. But then verse 34, which has plagued theologians for a long time. Truly I say unto you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So we have automatically a problem that we have to deal with. Jesus goes through all this teaching that on its surface seems to be, okay, that's all future. So the signs of his second coming, right? After the rapture. So rapture, 7-year tribulation, second coming. So rapture, 7 years, second coming. This whole text is talking about signs of his second coming. If we've been raptured, we're not here. So I know there's a lot of unclarity. That's why I'm trying to repeat this and make it as clear as I can. I think there's a lot of unclarity about that timeline amongst just kind of the lay person that's read the Bible or read some theology books or read the Left Behind novels. If you've read the Left Behind novels or watched the movies, those primarily are referencing the Great Tribulation period before the second coming. And so if Jesus is talking about signs of his second coming, well, if the dispensational perspective is correct, then the Christians won't be here you and I that are currently here today will be raptured in heaven. But he makes this statement. He says, all these things will not pass away. And truly I say unto you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. That's really a problematic statement for the dispensational perspective. So that's probably the biggest struggle if you're a dispensational reader saying, well, what does he mean, this generation? I mean, Jesus is sitting there talking to the disciples, and it seems on the surface that Jesus is saying, this generation, this current generation, 2,000 years ago, none of these things won't happen until, or this generation won't die, they won't pass away until all of these things have happened. And so that's a really hard verse to try and get around. And the main kind of answer that I've found amongst a dispensational pre-tribulational approach is simply that he's talking about this generation that's alive at the time of these events. And that's just how you have to work around that. And so the struggle is, if you're taking a very literal approach, it seems on the surface, just taking the plain reading of the text, Jesus is talking about the generation that was currently alive at his time of saying this, which would have been over 2,000 years ago. So is Jesus talking about events of the future? Well, possibly. That's a possibility. But if he is, then in answer to our original question, does coronavirus indicate something yet to come? Well, in short, no, not according to Jesus' teaching here. That would be all future. But what coronavirus and economic collapse and negative things do is they actually point to what? To a broken, fallen world, and they point to a day in which Jesus will come back. So is this a specific indicator of something on the cusp of happening? Not necessarily, but not necessarily not. And by that I mean, well, verse 36. Concerning the day or the hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. That's an incredible verse. Nobody knows. What day? The day of his second coming. Right? Now, day or hour, no one knows. Again, if you take a dispensational approach, you can kind of, from the time of the rapture to the time of the second coming, say it's 7 years. The struggle with that, Jesus says, of the day of the second coming, no one knows, not even the angels nor the Son. And so again, that puts a little bit of an interpretive wrench in a dispensational reading of this text. Well, you can get pretty close to saying this time of the second coming because you just go 7 years from the rapture and then there's a second coming. And the emphasis could be, well, Jesus is referencing the day and the hour. We don't know the specific day, right? Or the specific hour. It could be within a period of days. And so that's the explanation for that text. But here's the point I'm making, and that Jesus is making, concerning the day or the hour of his second coming, no one knows. Nobody knows. So is coronavirus a sign of the rapture? Well, Jesus doesn't reference that in this text at all. The only thing Jesus raptures what? Or Jesus references his second coming. Well, but Doug, what about the verses that come? For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And when they And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So it'll be an instantaneous, out of the blue type of thing. Verse 40. What about verse 40, Doug, right? Then 2 men will be left in the field. One will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one taken and one left. And so a lot of people interpret this to be like, oh, he's talking about the rapture. Well, if you're consistent in your interpretation of this text, a dispensational reading cannot mean that this is talking about rapture. It has to mean second coming, and that those being taken are actually being taken to judgment, and those left will be left to enter into the millennial kingdom. That's the actual dispensational interpretation. And so those that are dispensational scholars and pre-tribulational scholars, the way that they interpret this text is that Jesus is not talking about the rapture. He can't be. Why? Because the context is him talking about the signs of the second coming after the tribulation period. And so what Jesus is talking here about, with one grinding at the mill, 2 women grinding at the mill, one taken, one left, 2 men in the field, one taken, one left. A lot of people mistakenly say, well, that's talking of rapture. But it can't be. Not if this is all taking place after that time of great tribulation that we read about in verse 21. So therefore, the dispensational interpretation of one taken, one left behind is that the one taken is taken away to judgment. The one left behind is left behind to enter into the millennial kingdom. And so the whole concept of being left behind in this text is not referencing rapture, but referencing second coming and the end of that tribulation period. So, I said I was going to share with you 2 perspectives. That first one, that's the first perspective, that Jesus is talking predominantly about future events, the 7-year tribulation period primarily, and then at the end of the tribulation period, his second coming. That's the dispensational, pre-tribulational, premillennial perspective and interpretation of this text. Let me give you another interpretation and another way to look at Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 does talk about all of those things, but the question is this all future? Or are they all events that happened in the past? There is a third view called a preterist view that says all of these are just talking about events that happened in the past. But really there's another view that actually argues that the events that Jesus is talking about are events that were for immediate Israel, for his disciples, that generation, right? Verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So Jesus says, this generation, the things I'm telling you, they will happen now in your generation. So there is an interpretation that says, no, Jesus was actually talking about things that were going to happen to that generation that have already taken place. But foreshadowing and pointing to events like his second coming that would take place in the future. And so this interpretation basically understands that Jesus is answering their questions specifically. What questions was Jesus answering? When will these things be? What? The destruction of the temple, right? Chapter 23, he ends by talking about it. The beginning of chapter 24, you will not see one stone laid upon another. This temple will be desolate. It'll be decimated. It'll be destroyed. The disciples freak out and say, that's the end of the world, right? So tell us, when will these things be and what will be the signs of your coming and the end of the age? So the disciples automatically put the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the end of the age in one. And so what Jesus can do, according to a more of an amillennial type of perspective, is he kind of begins to teach them that they're actually 2 separate events. The destruction of Jerusalem and then his second coming are 2 completely separate events. And that the signs of wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, earthquakes, all of these things, Jesus says, don't let those things alarm you. The end is not yet. Those are the beginning of the birth pains. Those are the beginning. Those are the things that'll just kind of mark this age that we're in, right? From the first coming of Christ to his second, that you will just see these things over and over. And yeah, maybe they will intensify toward the end of the age more, So maybe you'll see more earthquakes and more wars and more famines and more plagues toward the end of the age, perhaps. But these things are just kind of the course of life in a fallen world. And so what is this that Jesus is warning them about? Well, to argue that this is not a future event, or these are not future events, but events of the past, there's a number of reasons why you might argue for that. First of all, the context pertains to the predictions of God's wrath against the current generation of Israel. The current generation. This leads to the expectation of fulfillment at that moment. So when Jesus is talking to his disciples, he's talking to them in that moment for stuff that applies to them. He's not talking to them about events that will happen thousands of years later. He seems on the surface, just with a general reading, to be talking to his disciples about events that they will experience, about events that they will see with their own eyes. Secondly, you might interpret this as not future because of the question posed by the disciples pertaining to the temple, then standing in Jerusalem, out of which they had just departed. So they'd come out of the temple up to the Mount of Olives, and so they asked him about this. So the context is what? Here's the temple. When will it be destroyed? Jesus answers that question. So is Jesus, beginning in chapter 24, verse 15, with the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, actually speaking to them prophetically about the destruction of their temple in their lifetime? That's the other interpretation. That this is actually events that Jesus said will happen with you guys. Does Jesus' answer pertain to the then standing temple, or does Jesus' answer pertain to a future temple? And to just take a plain reading of this, a plain literal reading, you would have to, according to this view, say that no, Jesus seems to be talking about the temple that was there, that they were looking at, that they had just come out of. Fifthly, you might interpret this as not future because the entire section is couched in terms of what is actual, of what his actual hearers are to see and hear and experience. And I've kind of said this before. You can't dismiss the way that Jesus talks, right? You will be hearing, verse 6. You will see that you are not frightened, verse 6, right? They will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated, verse 9. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, right? If anyone says to you, verse 23, I have told you in advance, even so you too, when you see all of these things, verse 33. So Jesus constantly says, you will see this, you will see this, you will experience this, you will experience this. Doesn't seem that he's saying future generations long in the future are going to experience this. It seems as though Jesus is talking to the disciples in their current situation, saying, no, you guys will experience this. That's just the kind of natural, literal kind of reading of this text. So it's hard at times to argue and say, well, this is all future, because it seems as though Jesus was talking to them about experiences they would have. But most importantly, verse 34, Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until all these things have come to pass. And so, in short, Matthew 24 is either talking about future events of a great tribulation period, or he's talking about events that would surround the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, the city of Jerusalem, the temple, from about the dates of 33 to 70 AD, from the time of his really ascension until, and if you don't know what happened in 70 AD, the Roman armies came under the leader of a general named Titus, and they surrounded the city of Jerusalem. They laid a siege around it, and they allowed the people in the city to undergo the most cruel and horrific types of living conditions that you can imagine. Historians like Josephus, who were alive, wrote of the conditions in the city of Jerusalem during the siege of the Roman army. Women would kill and eat their own children. People were killed in the streets. Food was just nowhere to be seen. They cut off all supply lines. And Israel entered a time of great tribulation such that she had never seen nor will ever see in the future. In fact, Josephus kind of, in his writings, made mention of that, not even referencing the biblical writings, but to understand the gravity of this situation, you need to understand how horrible it was for Jerusalem during that time. Eventually, the Roman army entered Jerusalem over the siege wall and decimated the city. Before that, there had been Roman generals that had made attacks against Israel. Israel had kind of defended it. And so this abomination of desolation that Jesus was warning was probably these Roman armies coming and preparing to destroy the city and to destroy the temple. Upon which they did enter the temple. Titus did. He entered the temple. And they there sacrificed and made Titus emperor. And they really made the temple desolate at that point. So what Jesus was saying to the fellow believers, really the Christians at that time, when you see these Roman armies coming in, this abomination that's going to make the temple desolate, flee, get out, run. And we know from history that pretty much all of the Christians did at that time. When they saw the Roman armies coming and they saw what was going to happen, they heard the words of Jesus and they fled and they escaped. And so Jesus talks in terms of what we call prophetic perspective. This is what would happen to that generation, this generation. But we still have these phrases, and this is where it gets difficult for this amillennial interpretation, is that he then teaches of a second coming. When? In verse 29. And so it seems as though Jesus talks about this time that would happen in answer to their question, when will the temple be destroyed? Jesus answers that question. These are the signs of the temple being destroyed, this abomination of desolation. When you see that happening, these Roman armies coming in and decimating, flee, get out. Don't believe false prophets during that time. And after the time of tribulation, then he says, he kind of springs forward and then he talks about his second coming. So Jesus is answering both questions here. Some argue that 29 through 31 are still referencing the destruction of Jerusalem. It seems as though he's talking about his second coming there, and so that's a difficult one to navigate just because he's talking about after the tribulation. Okay, so did Jesus come in all of his glory after the tribulation? No, he did not. His second coming didn't happen then. And so to argue that the description in verses 29 through 31 are not his second coming, it's plausible, but that's where it's difficult. That's why I say this text is very difficult, both for amillennialists, both for premillennialists. It's provided a lot of, so we have to have a lot of charity with one another as we work through this. But I want to draw you to verse 36. So Jesus has talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's warned them about that, and he's prophesied about that, and these are the signs of that. He's then said, now the after, right? He will come, and he'll gather his elect, right? And so that seems to be a reference to we know that it's a reference to his second coming. Of that there's no question. Amillennialists, dispensationalists, we all agree that that's a reference to his second coming. However, verse 36, concerning the day and the hour, no one knows, not even the angels. Now notice how Jesus teaches here. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So the next event on the timeline for an amillennial perspective is the second coming, which is the rapture and the resurrection and the judgment all in one. So how does he describe the second coming? Well, as in the days of Noah. People were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So it seems as though Jesus is saying, listen, the second coming is going to come at a time when nobody expects it. It's going to come at a time when you are eating, drinking, you're just living life, and it doesn't seem like things are bad or wrong, even though there's things going on in the world that are bad. But Jesus seems to say, hey, listen, when I come back, it'll come at a time when nobody even expects it. It'll come at a time when... Now, there are other texts that we don't have time to get into. What does Paul say about the end of the age? What does the book of Revelation say? We don't have time to get in there. And I wanted to specifically hit on Jesus' teaching here because I think these verses people read into a lot. And I wanted to give you some clarity on really the two primary views of looking at this. So here's my point, and I'll end with this. Whether you are a dispensationalist or you're an amillennialist, the answer to the question of coronavirus and what it means actually is kind of the same. Whether this is completely future or whether a lot of this happened to first century Israel around 70 AD, what we can expect throughout this age is death. We can expect disease. We can expect economic collapse. We can expect kingdoms to rise and fall. We can expect wars to happen. It's kind of been the MO for the last 2,000 years, right? We can expect all of that. And so the words of Christ are this. Whatever your eschatological end times view is, doesn't matter with regards to this. The words of Christ are, do not be shaken and endure and watch and wait and pray and look to Christ because he is coming back. And of that day and that hour, nobody knows, not the angels, not even the Son, only the Father. And it'll come at a time when you don't expect it, when you're not maybe even looking for it, when the world at large is not even anticipating any of it, and it'll happen. And so, what do we do in light of coronavirus and people losing jobs and the economy tanking and all of these things, right? What do? We remain faithful, right? That if this is all in the future, what Jesus is talking about, then it's all in the future. We just remain faithful. Jesus said these things would happen. They would mark the age. If we think that this is something that happened in the first century where Jesus was talking to that generation, to those people to be ready for, and then it points then to a future day of Jesus coming back that no one knows, okay, then what do? What's our response? Our response is the same. Don't be shaken. Don't worry. Why? Because Jesus is coming back. And when he comes back, he will come in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect, that's you and that's me, from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Two will be in the field, one taken, one left. Two will be grinding at the mill, one taken, one left. Again, I actually agree with the dispensationalists that those taken are taken to judgment, and that those left are left to enter into the eternal kingdom of God. And so I think Jesus' teachings here can ground us. They can give us a firm grounding that, man, there may be chaos all around us, but Jesus is coming back. And when he does, he will reign for all of eternity. So I hope this has been a help to you. I realize that we may have had more questions than answers. So if you have questions about Matthew 24, I'm going to try to answer those maybe next week. If you have questions now about, well, what does that mean then in relation to what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians or what John said in the book of Revelation, I would like this conversation to continue. I know we've gone a little long here today, but I wanted to give you as clear a teaching as I could just to kind of help you understand this is what Jesus said. This is what he taught. And so we should expect these things and not be shaken by them. And then in that, the church can really endure. So ask your questions, post them online, send me an email, that's fine. And we we'll try and get to those questions and work through them. So I'm going to close in prayer, and then we'll be done. God, I thank you for this day and this time and this hour, Lord. It's tough and it's difficult, and I pray that you would allow us to just stand firm in this reality, Lord, that you are coming back. God, that you'll gather your elect from the four corners of the earth, that you will reign on a throne, that you will be lifted high and every tongue will confess and every knee will bow, God. And so help us to rest in that hope and trust in that promise. We thank you for saving us. Now we ask for your protection. And God, I just want to say a prayer for all of our brothers and sisters who are struggling right now, that you'd protect them, their health, their safety, Lord, that you supply their needs, God, whether it be for jobs or for food or whatever it is, God, that you would show up and that you would provide and protect. So bless your church through this time. Allow us to rise and be a testimony to your saving grace in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you on Sunday at 9:30 a.m. Thank you, church.